Hello and welcome.
Hello.
Charlsey is a citizen of Leavenworth, Kansas. She first called Beyond Pesticides office with questions about how to change her city's mosquito management program. Since then, the progress she's made has been remarkable. Charlsey is joining us from her home in Leavenworth, Kansas. Charlsey, hello and welcome.
Hello. Glad to be here.
Describe where you live. Describe the city of Leavenworth, Kansas.
Leavenworth is right on the Missouri River, and the river flows just east of the city. And because of that, we have a lot of creeks that kind of flow into the river that go through directly through town. There's about 36,000 residents in Leavenworth. It's just right next door to Fort Leavenworth, and we're kind of nestled between Fort Leavenworth and Lansing, Kansas. And Leavenworth is the largest city in Leavenworth County.
Talk about your city's mosquito program and what made you concerned.
Well, Leavenworth had started spraying for mosquitoes at some point in the early 1950s, which was a very common practice of the time. And they've sprayed, to my knowledge, every year since then. They spray on a regular routine schedule. They have a grid that they go through, and every other week they spray one section of the city. And then so Monday they spray one area, Tuesday they spray another area, and they do that from about mid-spring until late summer every year, weather permitting. So if it's raining or if it's too windy, then they don't spray those days. But any day that it's nice and the weather is calm, then if they're able to spray, they spray for mosquitoes.
Just a follow-up question, Charlsey, is you said that they spray on a set schedule. Do you know what time of day they were traditionally spraying?
They had been spraying in the evenings for a long time. And then this year they started spraying in the mornings. They were spraying between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. And when I had inquired as to why they made that switch, they said that so that people can enjoy their yards in the evening. And so I interpreted that as they were trying to limit exposure to people that were outside after work in the evening in their yards.
Can you describe your goal for this project? And in a word, what would be a model mosquito management program for your city?
So the main thing we wanted them to stop doing was to stop spraying, especially on this regular routine schedule that they were doing. We wanted to see them increasing larvicide because that is been shown to be the most effective form of mosquito management. Really wanted to get the community involved, to get people to kind of take responsibility for their own yards and their own neighborhoods as far as that goes. And then also to increase monitoring and surveillance, and not only within the city of Leavenworth, but also within the whole county of Leavenworth.
That type of community engagement is critical, of course. But what would you say the reception was like when you brought your concerns or these goals to your city department or other city officials?
Well, when I called the streets department to find out what area was going to be sprayed first, well, after they announced everything, they were really, the people in the streets department were like, oh yeah, well, it's going to kill some bugs, but we'll kill the mosquitoes too, so who cares about those? And then, as far as the citizens went, I started making some posts on Facebook, and it was really just the status quo. Like, it had been going on for so long, not only in Leavenworth, but all around the world, or not the world, but the country, that it was just the status quo. Like, this is how you control mosquitoes. You don't go in your yard and dump the water. You just wait for the city to drive by and spray. So it was kind of a roadblock for a while to get that going. And then after speaking with one of the commissioners, he said, you need to bring this to his city council meeting and address the commission and address them, and we'll go from there.
Now,
so that's what I did.
Sorry to interrupt you there. Just talking about approaching the city commission, how did you bring them in? And did you attend any meetings yourself?
Well, so every other meeting, they have a little bit of time set aside for what's called citizen participation. And that's when any citizen of Leavenworth can come and address the council, directly to their faces and whatnot. And so I did that. And, I lined out environmental concerns. I lined out its ineffectiveness at actually controlling mosquitoes, health concerns, the concern about resistance, and all that. Because in my research of this, the chemical that we use, the brand name is Eveler 44, but it's permethrin. And permethrin, mosquitoes can become resistant to permethrin by one gene mutation, and then it's really localized. So the longer you spray permethrin, the quicker the mosquitoes become resistant to it, and then it doesn't do anything at all. And, that was one of my concerns with that. Another concern was cost. Is it really worth the cost? How much is it costing to do this? And at the end of that meeting, I had 2 commissioners approach me and say, hey, we didn't realize that this was an issue. Can you get us some more information? We want to look into this further.
So you went to the city commission, you found folks who were interested, or at least of learning more about the subject. Did you talk to, I'll say, fellow Leavenworth citizens, your neighbors, and follow up to that? How did they react to these concerns? Did you experience any pushback or just negativity?
Yeah, there was a lot of people that, I'll use this one lady for an example. She had a son that had a heart defect, and she wanted him to spray more because she was absolutely terrified that her son was going to contract West Nile virus from all these mosquitoes. And so I tried to reach out to her and say, hey, this is with resistance. This is the actual very low probability that your son will contract West Nile virus. And if we continue to spray these chemicals, it actually puts them at more risk because of resistance. And she was outright not having any of it. I mean, she didn't want to hear it. She wanted them to come and spray. And she actually had said, well, they can come by my house and spray the amount of pesticide that they didn't spray at your house. They can bring it to my house and spray my house even more. And even me trying to explain to her the health risks to her young son with his heart defect about being exposed to these pesticides, she did not care. She was absolutely terrified of West Nile virus. And as a matter of fact, there's only been 2 confirmed cases of West Nile virus in Leavenworth County since it was first detected in Kansas in 2002. So the probability of contracting that disease is almost nothing compared to, other risks from exposure to these pesticides.
What was it like bringing the idea of being it's called a mosquito breeder, meaning that mosquitoes are breeding or laying eggs on a person's property, in a person's backyard? What was the public's general concern or reception to that idea?
Oh, it was always the neighbor. It was never them. It's not my yard. It's the neighbor's yard. And why should I have to suffer because of my neighbor's yard? And I would say, well, have you talked with your neighbor? Have you offered to help your neighbor? Well, that's not my problem. The city will be by to spray, and so then it won't be an issue anymore. A lot of people saw being anti-spray as being pro-mosquito. Like, you don't want them to spray, so you want us to suffer more from these mosquitoes. But you would try to explain to them, take these steps, and it would reduce the mosquito population. But again, it was always the neighbor. It was never them. So they couldn't take responsibility for it, really.
What did you do after that? You've already contacted folks you live nearby. What was your next step?
Well, I contacted Beyond Pesticides again and was able to get some copies of a few research studies that were done. And then I also contacted a couple of entomologists from from Kansas State University. And both of them seemed very, I wouldn't so much say anti-spray, but they pretty much seemed to be in consensus that spraying was not effective, that it was not the way to go about mosquito management, and that it did have more negative environmental effects than it did positive effects on managing the mosquito population. And so I passed all that information on to Leavenworth city manager, and he had arranged for two of the entomologists to come up and address the commission at a to be determined date.
It's great that they were invited to speak at the commission meeting. Talk about what happened at that first city commission meeting, and then what the entomologist said to the commission members.
Well, going into it, I was really hopeful as to what the one particular entomologist had to say, as I'd had personal conversations with him prior to this meeting. So I was really hopeful that, of what he was going to say. And then the first words out of his mouth were, "Don't believe anything you read on the internet. It has to have .gov at the end or .edu. Otherwise, it's probably not true." And when he said that, my heart just sank, and I knew this was not going to go the way that I had hoped it was going to go. And, he talked a lot about how these pesticides are relatively safe to be exposed to, and the negative effects on pollinators were low, because if you don't have flowers, then you won't have pollinators that you'll be exposing them to. He said that he didn't think that these pesticides would negatively affect monarch butterflies in particular. He didn't think that they had any sort of residual effect on foliage. So if, a bee came several hours later and landed on a flower that had been directly exposed, he didn't think that that would be a problem. And so I left that meeting being very discouraged and just being deflated and really wanting to give up. And I was frustrated too, because I knew that some of the things he said were not true. He told the commission that permethrin was organic, that it was an organic compound that you could find in nature. And I knew that to be outright false information right from the get-go. He named off numerous cities within Kansas that he claimed also sprayed. And two of them that he named off, I had already spoken with previously in the summer, and I was dumbfounded. Like, why would he be spreading this information? So I spent about a day and a half just not wanting to do anything. I mean, I didn't even want to do housework. I was so just depressed about it. And then I called you again, and you really gave me a pep talk, and you said, "Charlsey, listen, watch the video again." You said, "Watch it, and here's a couple key points here. Watch this. You got this. Just keep going." And so I did. I watched the video again and was like, wow, yeah, I got this. And I wrote an email that was probably this long. I don't know if you can see, this long, and corrected all of his misinformation. One thing I think that the entomologist, didn't do was, I don't think he did his due research himself, because in my research I found three separate studies from the where's it from Florida International University, and then they also did it in conjunction with Loyola University, and all three of them talk about residual effects on foliage, how this stuff is harmful to butterflies, and I can't remember right off the top of my head what the third one was. But they pretty much all showed that these chemicals are much more toxic to non-target species than the industry and those .gov websites would lead you to believe. And I liked how they did the studies. They did them in, I don't know what's the word, real world exposures. So they would go to areas that had been sprayed by a city and collect data from there, and then take it back to the lab and analyze it. And what it showed was not good, and it would definitely affect the monarchs.
One thing that I had seen at the recording of the video for the commission meeting, there was a commissioner there who had requested for, what do you call it, a cost analysis of the spray program. Would you say that was a positive step forward, that they had that question?
Yeah, I think so, because I think that even though, the entomologist came and they kind of glazed everybody's eyes, I think that definitely she kind of saw through it. And at the end of it, she said, I'm not convinced. I'd like to see the cost of this, what it's costing us every year, because she didn't want to be doing it if it was basically just wasting money. Because one of the things that the entomologist said numerous times was it doesn't really do a whole lot to actually control the population. You know, and he did say, you know, it'll make some people feel good for a couple hours, but as far as controlling the mosquito population, you're not really doing anything for that. So, and, you know, I don't think that the average citizen really picked up on that. I think that they probably just heard what they wanted to hear, that it was safe and that it wasn't affecting the bees and the butterflies as much as, you know, I think it is, and that those studies showed that it is.
Bees, butterflies, and children especially.
Yeah.
One question I have, you know, or an additional question, Charlsey, is you said you wrote that email and you sent it out after the commission meeting. How was the email received? Was it, say, positive, or were there some negative responses?
You know, not really any negative responses, but I don't know if it gets much more negative than just being outright ignored. Most of the commission didn't even bother replying. And in fact, the two that I got replies from were the two that had originally said, hey, this seems like it's an issue and we should look further into it. But, you know, two of them, they never would acknowledge the information in the email. You know, even though I sent them information that said, hey, I can tell you for a fact that these cities don't spray, they still were like, oh, well, lots of cities in Kansas spray for mosquitoes, and that's simply not the case.
Now let's go to, it's that final commission meeting. Talk about, you know, that meeting where the final vote was taken for the mosquito program. What was the final consensus?
The final consensus was they don't think, or they didn't think that the $11,000 plus a year that was being spent on the program was worth it. So they've decided to take a 2-year break from regular routine spraying and see if there's an increased number of complaints. Because, you know, that was one of the things in the first meeting I went to, you know, what deems it necessary? And they always said, oh, high citizen demand, high citizen demand. Well, then come to find out, nobody's calling to complain about mosquitoes. You know, that's just not something that was happening. So they're going to give it 2 years to see if people do in fact start calling to complain about mosquitoes. They're going to work with, the plan is to work with the school districts to get some education on the school level, to educate the kids about, you know, mosquito life cycles and how you can stop the cycle. And then hopefully they're going to start enforcing ordinances that are already on the books. I mean, you can look through the ordinances and there's one about standing water, but I think it needs to be reworded to specifically say that harbor mosquito larvae. So that's where we're at now with that. So 2 years, and by that time, the two gentlemen that really seemed like they wanted it to continue, they are up for re-election in 2 years, and I know there's a lot of people in Leavenworth that are not happy with them about other issues. So I'm pretty hopeful that they won't even be on the commission in 2 years.
Just briefly, Charlsey, it's that type of personal and community empowerment that we message a lot at Beyond Pesticides, of saying, you know, you can look for mosquito breeding sites on your property, around your neighborhood. You can work with your neighbors to get that job done. And, you know, I have to applaud your effort, because bringing students into this effort is critical, as I said, because, again, they'll take this issue on and they can educate their parents. I'm curious if Leavenworth is looking to improve its larvicide program in particular, and how.
They said that they were going to reevaluate the areas that they placed the larvacides. Another thing that was brought up in that final meeting was providing mosquito dunks at the city service center at either low cost or, you know, the same price you can get them at the store, because we have a hardware store in Leavenworth, Home Depot actually, but they don't offer them there. And when I asked the manager, they said they just don't get enough people asking for them. And so that's why it was brought up that perhaps they should offer these dunks at the service center for purchase, which I think is great, because then that's kind of a talking point for if someone does happen to call and complain, they can say, oh, well, we're not spraying anymore. This is why we're not spraying, but we do have larva dunks for sale that you can come by and pick up.
Is Leavenworth planning to do any monitoring for mosquito numbers, and who would they be working with?
Hopefully that they will. We do have a university, the University of St. Mary's, that's here within city limits. And I've heard, though I have not contacted anybody yet, that they do have a really enthusiastic environmental study professor. So the plan is to contact her and see if maybe some of her students would be willing to conduct the surveillance and the trapping. And then hopefully work with Topeka to get the data analyzed, basically. So, and we have a really good state representative in Leavenworth too, Jeff Pittman. And so hopefully he'll be able to pull some strings in Topeka and be able to get us on the list for the data and analysis, basically, for the trapped mosquitoes.
Speaking as a former student myself, a little bit of extra credit always goes a long way, especially helping out the area where you live. So, Charlsey, just tell me what's next for you. Where are you going to direct your efforts?
I'm just going to kind of lay low for a little bit. I need a little bit of a break here mentally, but, you know, the city has asked me to help with the public education side of it. I have been going to elementary schools in the area and talking about different types of insects to the kids, and oh man, they love it. You can't hardly get them to sit down and stay still long enough to get the bug passed around before they're all jumping up and just everyone wants to see it all at once. I post a lot of kind of informational things about different types of insects and native plants that are found in Kansas, and like tell people, hey, these are really good for this, and you know, please consider planting a small native prairie in your yard and things like that.
I love the idea of bringing that education to kids, where you're saying, you know, this is what's at risk when we have these types of chemicals sprayed, these, I'll say, indiscriminate toxins, that it's not just affecting pollinators, it can affect all these other insects that, as you're saying, we should have a greater appreciation for. But Charlsey, I'm curious, because you're not the only person doing this type of work, but as you've already made great progress, what would you say to folks who are trying to get this type of work done, who are doing similar efforts?
Don't give up. It's a long road to travel, especially when it's the status quo. I mean, like I said, Leavenworth had been spraying since the 50s, and no one had really ever considered stopping. They never thought about there being a better way to do it. So don't give up. I know on Beyond Pesticides website, you can find a link to an article that's called The 5 Steps to Changing Your City's Mosquito Program. And those are some really good 5 steps. It's like, you know, learning all everything you can about the program, learning everything you can about the chemical, getting community involvement, addressing, you know, going to the city, and then follow up, you know, those kind of things. That article is really good. It's a really good thing to follow. And really just, you know, to begin with, just put some feelers out. Find a couple people that feel the same way you do, and just go with that. Just start running with it. And don't give up. If you don't win right away, just find out when the next election is and kind of bide your time and do everything you can to protect your family and your property. And then vote them out. So that's why I was really happy when they did decide to stop, because I knew that if they didn't this year, we wouldn't have another chance for 2 more years.
I have to echo that sentiment. Don't give up. We always tell folks to be persistent. And Charlsey, thank you for your time. Thank you for your accomplishments. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
No, thank you.